Lead Time is a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective, hosted by Tim Allman and Jack Caliberg. Lead Time taps into biblical wisdom for practical solutions to today's burning issues. Each podcast confronts real-time struggles facing the local church in a post-Christian culture. Step into the action with the ULC at uniteleadership.org. This is Lead Time.
Welcome to Lead Time. Tim Allman here. Jack Caliberg is on vacation, and I am blessed today to sit down and to learn with Lexi Schmidt and Micah Greiner. Now, Micah, you and I have known each other for, maybe 7, 8, 9 years. Micah is a lead pastor at St. Peter's Lutheran Church and School in Arlington Heights, Illinois, and then the future home of the Chicago Bears. You put in your bio, that's pretty funny. They are moving though, Micah. Is that true?
They actually made 2 miles from my office that way. So we're banking on it.
No way.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And Micah's been...
We got parking plans. This is going to be great.
This is going to be great. Make some coin. Micah's been at St. Peter's for 15 years, right out of seminary. This is your one and only congregation, and he's married to his awesome wife, Sarah, 2 teenage children. It's Eva, right? And Drew?
Eva. I didn't realize we were going
to and then
miserable by
Micah's.
Yeah, it's the German pronunciation for the name Eve. So we kind of love that. So
I like it. Eva. And Micah's committed to bringing the light and love of Jesus to their neighborhood and living out their vision to be the brightest house on the block. And can't wait to get into our neighboring principles. Now, Lexi, you work for LINC. Now, for those of us who have been listening to Lead Time for some time, Ben Griffin and I had a conversation, I think it was on the American Reformation podcast a few months ago, but tell us a little bit about yourself and your work in urban and suburban settings for the past 15 years and how you and Micah have been doing life together.
Yeah. So I started out as a teacher in Chicago, was teaching there for 5 years, and then actually got called out to St. Peter in Arlington Heights, where Micah is at. I was there for 8 years. My heart is very much in the city. And so that was one of those things where I was wondering what God was doing with that time. And one of the big things was that Micah is very good at letting you do things, try new things. And that really helped me gain confidence before kind of moving on to being back in the city. So that was great. I am a clinical or a clinician, a clinical therapist as well. And so I've done a lot of work in the nonprofit world, working anywhere from the ER to an organization called Reclaim 13 that works with girls who have been trafficked. So yeah, that's kind of my background. And then in 2020, I got a phone call from Micah during the beginning of the pandemic, just asking to meet with LINC and their executive director and Micah, and learned a lot about their mission and just loved it. I was actually in Milwaukee at the time, serving in urban ministries there. And so to me, it didn't make any sense, but God was calling me to do it. And so I moved back to Chicago in 2020 and have been working with LINC ever since.
Oh, that's amazing. I want to just ask questions about your work with teens. We weren't planning on really going here, but How did you fall in love with kind of counseling and especially caring for teenagers? And I'm asking this from an honest place because I have three teenagers myself right now.
Yeah. When I student taught in first grade and loved it and thought I was going to always be with little kids. And then God called me into middle school and I just adore it. I think there's just so much tension there that needs to be spoken into of, these developing adults and, helping them to see their identity, to be confident in their identity, and then to also kind of explore what their callings and passions are. It's a really exciting time in life. And so with working with women who have been trafficked and girls who have been trafficked, I think there's a lot of work in just restoring their identity and helping them to come back to who God has made them to be. And so the restorative work has been really exciting. So kind of the preventative side has been in the classroom, and the restorative side has been in the therapeutic setting.
What part of that work, Lexi, is shaping your work now with LINC? How does that shape your heart and your urban mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of our mantras is that no leader walks alone. And so I actually use my counseling skills quite a bit in just listening and walking alongside and encouraging. So I think that is one of the big pieces, is just being able to listen to leaders who are in really hard situations and hard work and needs an encourager beside them. And then the teaching component, I really miss teaching. I'm a teacher at heart for sure. And so there are ways that I feel like God is using that, whether it's, educating people on who we are and what our mission is, or meeting with leaders. I work a lot with this incoming generation. And so it's a lot of different kind of teaching, but this generation is awesome that's coming up. I'm really excited to get to work with them so much.
So one last question. I'm going to get to Micah and the Brightest House on the Block. This is some exciting stuff. What's the main vision right now of LINC in the Chicagoland area?
Yeah. So, I mean, our main vision as an organization overall is that everyone would hear the gospel from someone that they know in terms that they can understand. And so our vision in Chicago is we have 77 neighborhoods. We have hundreds of nations in Chicago. And so our goal is to reach the local leader, to empower them and equip them so that they're able to share the gospel with people that they know deeply and well, and in terms they can understand. So that's our goal. One of the kind of exciting things that's on the horizon is we're starting hubs, which makes sense for just even geographically because Chicago is a really big city. But that's another kind of piece of our vision that's exciting right now, is having hubs all over the city that are meeting grounds for people who are on mission, that they can get together, they can be equipped, they can do trainings there. Part of the equipment is, if they want to host a podcast, that we have a podcast studio in one of our hubs. So,
man, that's super cool. And you're working with a lot of indigenous leaders in all these different communities to lead these hubs. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So we have hub leaders, and it's something that we're kind of prototyping right now. So our goal is that we'll have 2 to 3 hubs within the new year. So right now it just kind of looks like us finding a hub leader, then having a meeting within that community to hear from the leaders themselves what they need to be better equipped.
So it's not necessarily a hub is not a church. It's like a gospel expression opportunity. Is that kind of how you're articulating hubs?
Yes, absolutely. And in some cases it is in the church, but there's also a goal to be inside nonprofit. LINC's Milwaukee office is actually inside a huge food distribution center for Milwaukee. And so it's great to be in community with people and not necessarily just inside of our churches.
So good. And I just have all these questions. So, and how are you training your leaders? I'm curious about that for the hubs.
Yeah, we're not prescriptive. And so we do have 2 manuals that we use when we're coaching. So one is My Leadership Pathways. That's a really good one for just like discernment and healthy living. We really want to have a holistic approach to ministry. And so part of it is, making sure that we're following the leader well, leading ourselves and our families well, leading others well, leading leaders well, and then leading movements well. And then the other manual that we use is just a new start guide. So anybody who is starting something new, it takes you through mission and vision, financial strategy, mission strategy, building a healthy team, communications, all that stuff. So while we're not prescriptive, we do have resources that we use. But for each leader, it's different. Every time I sit down for a coaching session, it's asking, what do you want to work on today? What can we be working on for this month? So yeah, it all looks a little bit different per leader.
Lexi, I love your heart, man. The joy and love of Jesus radiates from you, and I'm so glad he's called you into this role. It's very, very exciting. So one of your hub leaders, I don't know if you call him a hub leader, is Micah Greiner at the Brightest house on the block. Not only a pastor, but I've been impressed, bro, down through the years. Like some of your manliness just rubs off on me, and I feel like I'm more handy. I'm like Tim the Toolman Taylor, vicariously watching your house get totally remodeled. I'm looking at a picture right now of a work day where you had people come and help, and they voluntarily gave their time. And you gave him a T-shirt. I'm sure you gave him some food too that says the Brightest house in the block. So how did this vision come about, man? It's inspiring.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. And by the way, if you want a T-shirt, all you got to do is fly up to Chicago and come hang with us. And anyone who helps around the house, we bought 75, 80 of these T-shirts. Actually, I have one right here. The Brightest house in the block is the family vision and our logo. And that's what our house is eventually going to look like. So the backstory would be to say, Sarah and I, my wife and I moved to Chicago area in 2007, placed here out of the seminary, just like you and everyone in our Missouri Synod kind of pastoral formation and church worker system. And one of the convictions that I had coming out of seminary was I didn't want to be one of those guys who was just in a place for 3 years and then moving on. And so for whatever reason, God just planted in my heart and in Sarah's heart this deep desire to go deep in our community. Both in our congregation and then also in our neighborhood. It was our first chance to own our own house. We'd rented, we moved several times early on in our marriage, and we just were super excited to get to know our neighbors and to figure out what it was like to be in a neighborhood. Both of us grew up in Michigan, out in the kind of country outside of town, so we had never lived in a neighborhood ever. And so we were pumped about it. What we didn't know was early on, Jesus was stirring in us this desire to embrace a missional life and missional living where we bring the light and love of Jesus to our neighborhood because most of them don't go to church and probably never will. And our goal then became, and we just discovered this over a long period of time, our goal became becoming friends with them, sharing life with them so that they might have a chance to see the life of Jesus in us. And what that looks like on a practical level would be for our immediate neighbors. I'm talking about probably 8 to 10 houses up and down the street on either side of us. We share a meal probably almost every week during the warm weather months. We have a Christmas party and an Easter vigil party where we bring them over to our house or to one of their houses, and we celebrate those holidays. We read through the Christmas story. We pray together now. We sing favorite Christmas songs and carols, which sadly also includes Mariah Carey's. But we're gonna embrace Christmas in any way we can. But
All I Want for Christmas,
exactly.
All I Want.
It's amazing how much,
Yeah.
how many baby boomer dudes love that song. I'm just gonna leave that there for now. But
I'm a fan. I'm not gonna lie. I love it when it rolls around.
So what we've seen is people who were disconnected from church get reconnected to churches, ours and others. Catholic churches, Methodist churches, Lutheran churches. We've seen self-professed atheists join in prayer in our community just because we've been doing life with them now for 15 years. And at the same time, we've had this house that has been sorely in need of some care. And on the inside, we did a lot of work on our own over those years, but there's a lot of stuff on the outside. And we have 2 teenagers like you're talking about, Tim. You've got a few, we've got 2, and it's not a big house. So long story short, we've been dreaming for all of these 15 years about this project. And we thought we were going to get started in the summer of 2020 or 2021 rather. God said no, that was not the right time for a variety of reasons. And so we got delayed until this summer of 2022. And what we were convinced of was that if God wanted this to happen, if this was truly part of his vision for our family to be the Brightest house on the block, he was going to raise up the women and men who would help us get it done. And so kind of just in a posture of dependence on him, we said, we're not going to be able to do this. Number one, we can't afford to hire someone to do it all. So that's a reality. Number 2, we want to do it ourselves and we want to bring in friends. And so we've had, for the most part, volunteers from our church and neighborhood community helping us out. We've hired out a few things that are just better to have a pro do it. And it's been a whole lot of fun over the last few months to get started on it. So our dream out of the house would be not only to have a place where we could live and support our family from, but also be a gathering place that ultimately might lead to a little house church in our neighborhood, in that community. So that's where it's kind of like our little playground for that, Tim.
Dude, so proud of you. And Sarah, it's not surprising having known you guys that you would choose this path. A lot of folks, so Micah would say that's pretty radical, man. Like, I don't have hospitality as a spiritual gift, and so speak to just the everyday Christian. You may say that's a little. I'm reading let's set it up this way. I'm reading the Cost of Discipleship right now again. It's probably a third or fourth read. It's a well-worn book. And he says, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like consistently, that unless faith is lived out, we cheapen grace, and we really don't understand the gospel. And to say it in with a Lutheran lens, our baptismal identity, it radically transforms our heart and our mind. And we cannot help but declare in thought, word, and deed the one who's called us out of darkness into a marvelous light. And why not start with our neighbors? Like, we've lost that neighborly sense in many respects in the church and just in American Western culture in general. And so I guess let me ask you this question. Do people look at you and think you guys are kind of weird? And what do you say to the people that think you're weird for doing this?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't get a lot of people saying we're weird. I do get a lot of people saying we can't do what you do. And the answer to that question is Jesus doesn't want you to do what we're doing. Jesus wants you to pay attention to the people he has around you and to discover ways that you can grow closer with them in relationship so that they have a chance to see the light and the love of Jesus in you too, right? And so it's going to look different for a single mom in an apartment than it does for us married, 2 incomes, 2 middle school kids in a suburban community. It's going to look different in an urban environment. It's going to look different in the country. What is going to be the same is people are people everywhere, and people need community, right? And they actually long for it, but they're really bad at it. By and large, we're more connected than we've ever been and more disconnected than we've ever been at the same time. It's kind of a really strange thing. And really, it stood out to me during COVID. As I was looking at my neighborhood, we shifted all of our life into our neighborhoods because that's where we lived and that's where we worked and that's where we played the whole time, right? Because we couldn't go other places by and large, right? It was different across the country, but in Blue State, Illinois, we were pretty much hard lockdown for a good long while. And I thought to myself, wow, here's this time where God has all of humanity just full-time in their neighboring communities. What could the Church of Jesus Christ do during that time? Because you've got people rubbing shoulders, looking across fences, helping each other out. It had so much potential. I think by and large, in the Western church, maybe, we missed out on that opportunity. But it illustrated for me how important it is for us to be aware of the people around us where we live, work, and play, especially those who are close to us but far from Jesus. Because there's an opportunity every single human has to make an impact there. And for Sarah and I, we're off the charts extroverts. And that's unusual to have 2 married who are both, so extroverted. What we're really good at is gathering people and creating space where community can happen. What we're not as good at is going deep in relationships, right? So I would say to the majority of people who are more on the introverted side, they actually have something that I don't have. That is that they can listen better than I can. They can go deeper in a relationship than I can. And the Church of Jesus Christ needs everyone in order to accomplish its fullest mission. So it's going to look different. It's going to feel strange at first, but what we found is our neighbors long for connection and community. They just needed a spark, someone to start the conversation, some to invite them to the first meal, and then they just keep coming. So one other example would be in our neighborhood, we discovered Halloween is actually one of the best days in our neighborhood, right? Which seems strange because I grew up in a church that said, dressing up for Halloween is like evil because you're celebrating darkness. And I really struggle with this because I never went trick-or-treating my whole life until I moved into this neighborhood. And then it's like the streets come alive. And so Sarah and I had to figure out what are we going to do. And long story short, we said, if that's the best night in the neighborhood, we want to have the brightest house that night. And that's where some of this language really kind of got started. So fast forward, we're in the middle of our construction process. So we have a set of lights around our dumpster in the front yard, right? It's all torn up in a mess, but we have 7 families and a bonfire set up in our driveway, handing out oodles of candy. We give out free drinks and snacks for the adults too. And now the families in our neighborhood make our house the last stop of the night so they can hang out for a while, talk to their friends and neighbors, and enjoy the hospitality we have to provide. And our neighbors have just rallied around that. They turn off the lights at their house and they come to our house to be able to have community while we're also engaged in the community. It's a pretty cool thing.
Wow, that's amazing. Lexi, as you hear Micah talk, anything to add?
Yeah, I love what they're doing. And that is an example of a leader that we would be walking alongside as they're doing that in the city. One of the ministries out of LINC SoCal is the Fruitful Home, which has a very similar concept to what Micah and Sarah are doing. And I think sometimes I don't think Micah and Sarah were looked at as weird, but certainly in this city, not necessarily looked at as weird, but just like skeptics of this is what church should look like. And this is what life and discipleship should look like. It should be inside our church as opposed to like out in our neighborhoods. And so I think sometimes people, especially with LINC, just need somebody to say, you're not crazy, you're not in the wrong. This is something God has put in your heart, and how can we help you to get there?
Yeah, it's awesome. I've been wrestling a lot with mission and evangelism. As you look at the word, I did a lot of work for my thesis on missiology. As you look at the theological spectrum of missiology, Lexi, how does missiology connect to then evangelism? Is there a difference? How do they interact?
This is probably going to sound super simplistic, but in my mind, evangelism is speaking the gospel, and mission is living it out in community and intentionally. And a lot of times I think it's being called to move into a neighborhood. Again, to relate to Micah and Sarah's story, God called them to Buffalo Grove, to that community, and they're on mission now. So yeah, I don't want to oversimplify things, but in my mind, that's the difference is, evangelism is speaking the gospel and mission is living it out.
Yeah, Tim, if I can jump in on that real quick, a couple of things I'd say. My home church in the Lansing area in Michigan, for my whole childhood and formative years, was all in on door-to-door evangelism. And so when I was in high school, I was trained to go, so some of our listeners will know D. James Kennedy and Evangelism Explosion, go knocking on doors. If you died tonight and before God in heaven, and he said, why shall I let you in my heaven? What I say, and so I had the 2 questions down. I had grace, man, God, Jesus Christ, faith. I had the whole thing. I have the illustrations, the tightrope, everything. And I remember as a high schooler going out doing door-to-door evangelism, and on the one hand, feeling terrified, but also thrilled, like I was doing God's work. And then I cut my teeth in mission globally, training people in Central and South America and Madagascar in evangelism. Okay, and then I get called to my local church, and my first position here was outreach pastor. One thing we didn't mention, by the way, is a dear friend and mentor to me in those early formative years was Lexi's dad, Carl Schmidt, who's sainted now, but he was longtime in-reach pastor on our staff. And so there are some long and deep roots that Lexi and I have just seen woven together, and God is good. But and St. Peter, the congregation I serve, also during that same time that my home church was all in on evangelism, was hosting workshops, was sending its pastors across the country doing evangelism training. So I got here as the outreach pastor, and everyone's like, okay, we're going to do this again. And then what we quickly realized is I could get like 5 people in a room to get excited about evangelism, and we'd go through a resource or a training, and no one would do anything. Right? No one would do anything. Yeah. We would hand out water bottles at the train station. That was a nice, like, little token thing to do. But the reality is there was a few people who had a passion for evangelism, but they had already saturated all their circles of influence, and so they didn't know anyone else who was an unbeliever, because all their friends and all their connections, for the most part, were church members. And so there was this desire on the part of a few to do evangelism. It was a program in their mind that they had to get trained up in so that they could have the right answers when somebody asked, as opposed to a posture and a way of life. So I've kind of shifted over the last 15 years. And what I would say would be evangelism at its root is very, very simple. It's speaking good news. All right, capital G, capital N, good news. That's the root of it. And it's always good news from Jesus for the problems of the world. And what the problems the world has right now are exactly what the gospel answers. right? All the big questions, why am I here? Where am I going? Why is this world such a mess? Like, am I important? Like the gospel answers every single one of them in spades. There's nothing else out there that addresses those big problems. And the problem is the church as a structure and organization is the last place that lost people want to go to find those answers, because the church has been self-righteous, self-centered, self-serving for too long. And so people have been hurt and burned, and they're not going to look to the church. They're not going to look to worship services primarily. In some places this might still work, but in Chicagoland, what we're seeing is it's just, you can't have a fancy program in a new building and suddenly have thousands of people coming from unbelief to belief. So the solution has to be women and men and girls and boys who have been discipled in the words, ways of Jesus, who are connected to the people who are close to them and far from Jesus, in their schools, in their shopping centers, in their neighborhoods, whatever that is, whenever they do neighboring, and that's a pretty inclusive concept. It could be at the train station, could be at the workplace, could be at the gym, but in tune to who's there and who is Jesus making ready and who needs good news. And then when you're doing that missional life, the opportunity to speak good news presents itself. It's not hard. It's not complicated. You don't need to have every encyclopedia answer from the Bible in your brain already, because you're also still growing more like Jesus, right? And still learning his words and ways. So you can be like, actually, I don't know the answer to that question. I need to go look into that. And that's normal, right? So, but you can share, hey, God's transformed my life. I have hope now. My marriage is better. My family is better, whatever the case might be. I feel more connected to God. I pray more. You could talk about the things that you're doing as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. And that's approachable for people who are far from Jesus. And so you have a chance to bring that to them where you're already going. You don't have to go out on a trip. You don't have to go door to door and talk to strangers. Start with the people that are already close to you but far from Jesus. And oh, by the way, church member, if you don't know anyone who's close to you and far from Jesus, that's step one, right? Pray, okay, Jesus, who is it? Number one. Number two, make space in your time and your life to go and get to know them, because they are there. You're just not paying attention to them. Yeah,
no, that's so good. Jesus is so amazing, and he's so on the move, and the Bible is so rich. It's a living book. Lexi, is there a story or two from Scripture that like awakened your heart to this idea of the missional life that Jesus through his Spirit is calling us to?
Yeah, well, my favorite book of the Bible is Luke, for sure. I feel like for Christians and non-Christians, how can you not see the person of Jesus and see just this amazing human being who treated people in these incredible ways and spoke the truth in love and was super radical in everything that he did. So anyway, I love Luke. And in particular, the story that always just touches my heart is the thief on the cross. In my own personal life this year, there was somebody who harmed me, who I was really struggling with unforgiveness and didn't realize it. And I think just keeping in mind that we are God's inheritance, and, I forgive much because I've been forgiven much. Going back to grace, that once you experience grace, like it's impossible not to give it. So I think just the thief on the cross is a reminder to never give up on somebody. And I think that in response to your last question, I do see some giving up, especially in the city, that, you hear really hard things coming from the city. It doesn't sound great. I mean, Chicago has more gun violence than New York and LA combined. And so, we're hearing these stories on the news every day that, children are being killed in crossfire, and it's just really difficult. But I think, the worst thing that we could do is walk away from it and to, say that's their problem. It's a problem, and I don't want to get near it. I don't want to be proximate. So anyway, all that to say, going back to the thief on the cross, I mean, Jesus he is with you during the whole journey, and he is for you. And even in his dying moments, he is saying grace is here. So
I love the story of Thief on the cross and Jesus's radical hospitality to the broken, repentant sinner. And have you preached on this, Micah? I'm sure you have, Good Friday or other times. I mean, today you'll be with me in paradise. I heard a good understanding of what paradise is. Paradise is like a vacation. It's like going to Cancun or something like that. But there's this recognition that it's not necessarily home, and that our home is right here and is not yet here when Jesus comes back to give us mansions that we can't even begin to fathom. The hospitality of Christ for the broken, contrite sinner is something that the older I get, Micah, like the more I sound like a older pastor. I think like all the world needs is confession and absolution and law and gospel and a recognition of who I am apart from Christ and yet who I am with him. And it's the best thing going is sharing that in thought, word, and deed with our neighbors. You've been a long time pastor now, 15 years, Micah. And one of my frustrations is when I hear, because our church really, we strive to resist that internal tug, bro, to like say, no, life is about me. And if you're a part of, I think, both of our churches, you recognize I'm going to come and I'm going to hear a word that's going to cut me and it's going to give me life. And I'm going to be restored or reoriented today by the power of the word and spirit. But you still have members that will say, and most of the time they don't say this to me, by the way, Micah, Lexi, they say it in a survey, anonymous or whatever. The church should do more to care for its members rather than go on mission for those that aren't believers. What do you think or say when you hear that comment? Because I've even teased it out in worship. We don't exist for ourselves, right? Like this whole thing isn't about you and us. So sometimes I'm a little Lutheran snarky in that regard. But yeah, how do you respond when you hear that, Micah?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things we could kind of dig into from your reflection there. The first thing I would just note, St. Peter as a congregation was founded in 1860. So think Abraham Lincoln, Civil War.
Yeah, right.
7 German farmer families decided they needed a German evangelical Lutheran congregation before our town was actually even incorporated. So we existed before Arlington Heights town, future home of the Bears, ever came into being, right? And 100 years after our church was founded, they sold their church building, a beautiful brick, tower, steeple sort of thing, school next door. They sold it and they moved north to the edge of town. And they built a brand new campus. They raised $1 million, which was huge at the time, 1958, 59, to build this campus, bought 13 acres. And what they didn't know at the time was God was going to send a bunch of Lutherans out of the city of Chicago who wanted to move into the suburbs in this post-war kind of baby boomer era. And so the whole community just grew like crazy around it. The church did too, okay? The church grew like crazy. And so at one point in time, all the numbers, by the way, were round numbers in multiples of hundreds and thousands in the church records back then. But so at something like 6,000 members, 2,000 people on a Sunday, back before there were really mega churches. St. Peter considered themselves, one of these big mega churches, and they had the ego to go with it. I say that to say God has had the church go through a season of humbling and repentance. Before my time, Lexi, as you were growing up, you could tell stories about this during my time and even recently. And periods of pruning and times of humbling and repentance are painful, but they're necessary because Jesus says, right, that if you want to be fruitful, you have to get pruned, right? And everyone who remains in me and I in them, they'll bear much fruit, but not until you go through this pruning season. So here's where I'm going with this. The Church of Jesus Christ is alive and well and thriving here and throughout the world because Jesus is triumphant, risen from the dead, lives and reigns to all eternity, and is returning to make this world everything that it wants to be, could be, should be, but can't be now because of sin, right? God is coming to redeem and restore all creation. The problem is the institutional church is no longer where the Church of Jesus Christ resides primarily. It's like Jesus has moved camp, and it's kind of partially overlapping the structures and the forms of what was, but it's not contained within the denominations and even the local congregations that we all grew up with. So it's this fascinating thing where Jesus is winning, while in some cases our churches feel like we're losing. And the people who feel that the most are the ones who have spent their whole time, their whole lives, all their energy building up, running, and holding on to this thing they call church, which is actually the outer form, the structure of what once worked, but no longer, and I think increasingly will not be effective in engaging and discipling the people in our communities. Right? I'm not saying churches need to go away. I'm not saying church buildings or even church services need to go away. I'm not saying that at all. Those will still have a long life, I think, for a while. But the mission of God is not confined to the divine service or to Sunday school, or in our case, we have a large Lutheran school like you do at Greenfield, to our classrooms. The mission of God is, it includes everyone on the planet, right? We just had the 8 billionth human born this past week or two, right? God has a heart for every single human being on this planet, and he has one strategy for them to have a chance to hear about the hope of Jesus that leads to faith in him, which gives them the promise of eternal life. And he wants as many people on his planet, once he's got it perfect, as possible. That's why we're still here, right? Like if Jesus were done with his redemption story, we'd all be there, right? But we're still here because God wants more humans, right? That's why he created the planet in the first place. That's why he's going to perfect it in eternity. And so right now we're living in this anticipatory, not there yet, but having some of the first fruits of the resurrection life. And so we're waiting for the consummation of the ages. We're waiting for the return of the Lord. We're waiting for the final judgment where there'll be the separation of the righteous and the unbelievers from the sheep and the goats. You know all that language, right? And Jesus is saying, hey, I got work to do. Like one thing I'll just add, and then I'll stop talking, is a thing that stood out to me in the last few years is actually both in Luke and in Matthew. Jesus says, the harvest is already ready. Pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out more workers into his harvest. And Tim, I know you love this, Luke 9 and 10 and Matthew 9. And what struck me a couple years ago reading through that was, for my whole life, I've been told that's about more pastors. And in some part it is, right? We need more trained men to be pastors. We need more women trained to be deaconesses, evangelists, other leaders. We need a lot more laborers in that vocational sense. But what really struck me was Jesus saying, Micah, I want every girl, boy, woman, and man who's part of the St. Peter community to see themselves as being part of that harvesting, right? So what would it look like if every girl, boy, woman, and man in every one of our congregations and in all our communities saw themselves as part of the mission of God, where they lived, worked, and played, and we were in the business of equipping them to get that work done? What difference could that make in our communities? What needs to stop programmatically in our churches that's actually a distraction from that, so that we can get back to the primary task of making disciples who make disciples who reach the lost and bring a harvest into this new creation life that God's planning and prepared. It's just around the corner. Can't wait.
So good. I love you pointed us to the mission of God. Lexi, any final words, especially around the mission of God?
Yeah, just in response to your last question, Pastor Steve Carter had this message where he talked about they didn't know black swans existed until the 16th century, but it only took one person actually seeing a black swan to know that they existed and to be able to confirm it. And so I think when I think of in-reach and outreach, I think if we are going to be real deal Christians, and if we're going to be people who are showing the world that there are black swans in the world, we have to be out in the community. Like, we can't just be inside our church hiding, or no one's going to ever encounter it. And are you a real deal Christian if you are only inside your church? So I think that's just one thing. And also, just going back to the discipleship journey, we are being discipled. the thorn in our side, we're asking for it to not be removed, but to develop. And so I think I just don't want us to miss out on being on mission with God and having mission hearts like God has. Because like another total random example, but Stevie Wonder wrote this amazing piece of music. He can play all 10 parts, right? But he invites actually this 18-year-old kid to play keys on it for his album that wins millions of Grammys, right? They ask him, why would you have this 18-year-old kid play keys for you? You're obviously you wrote the music, you can play it, why would you do this? And he said, I wanted to invite him into this experience. And to me, that's what this is about. God is inviting us into the experience. He can do anything on his own. His spirit moves regardless of us. Jonah is a perfect example of that. He goes and he's actually on mission, but he has totally the wrong spirit when he says stuff, but the spirit still works and changes the hearts of the Ninevites, right? So God can do anything, and he can do it with or without us, but he wants us to be with him, and it's so much better when we're on mission with him. So anyway, a total tangent, but yeah.
So good, Lexi. What a joy. It's a missional podcast when you have Mariah Carey and Stevie Wonder and Jesus spoken about all in the same podcast. This has been legit. Hey, Lexi, if people want to connect with you and Micah, how can they do so?
Yeah, follow us on Facebook, Instagram. We're LINC Chicago on both. And
LINC, right? Yep.
LINC Chicago. Micah, do you want to share?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook and Gmail, pastor.greiner, both of them. There's only 2 Micah Greiners in the world, by the way, at least as far as Facebook's concerned. The other one lives in Pennsylvania. I friended him. He's a little better looking, but he's not a pastor. So it'll be pretty easy to figure out which of the 2 Micah Greiners you're looking for. So.
All right, man. This has been a lot of fun. Hey, listener, sharing is caring. Getting the word out about Lead Time. If we can care for you in any way, we're setting up a lot of conversations, upcoming conversations with Lutheran Church Missouri Synod leaders. Right now, I'm going to be interviewing Pat Ferry, former president at Concordia, Wisconsin, and potential future leader within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So we are grateful to have you here. Wherever it is that you are consuming these podcasts, please share, subscribe, all of that. It really, really helps us. It's a good day. Go and make it a great day. Thanks for joining us on Lead Time. Thanks, Lexi. Thanks, Micah.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
So fun. Peace.
You've been listening to Lead Time, a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective. The ULC consults and brings together cohorts of congregations to build the culture, systems, and structures of intentional discipleship multiplication. To go deeper with us, create a free login on uniteleadership.org for access to exclusive materials and resources. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next week's episode.